Welcome to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 93, a special Hanukkah edition. A Freilich and Hanukkah to all of you. It should be a blessed and illuminating Yom Tov that shall illuminate every aspect of our lives. And as the message of Hanukkah so aptly underscores, that you specifically light the menorah, Mishatishka Achama, as the sun sets, as the darkness falls, signifying that Hanukkah has the power to pierce every crevice, every point of darkness in our lives. This is an excellent opportunity, an excellent demonstration how Chassidus Applied can apply Hanukkah to our personal lives. You don't need to think long or hard to recognize that the entire theme of Hanukkah is light and dark. Chassidus asks the question, why is the mitzvah of Hanukkah, mitzvahs hayem, as the Gemara says in Shabbos, is it by lighting the menorah, lighting the flames? L'cheira, the war was the main thing, that they won the battle of the Yevonim against the Yevonim. The Maccabees won the battle, and without the winning of the battle, they would not have been able to light the menorah. So that's the cause for the Nitzachon. And as we see in other Yom Tov, let's say Pesach, we actually remember that. We mentioned the Makkos and so on and so forth. So why by Hanukkah is there barely mention, except in some of the tefillahs we mentioned the battle in Al Anisim and and so on? Why is the mitzvah focused on lighting the Eir? So the Alter Rebbe explains in Teireh Eir, and the Mittler Rebbe elaborates in Shari Eira, where one of the Shari Eira is on Hanukkah. Shari Hanukkah, it explains because the power of Hanukkah is captured in the flame. The battle of the Yevonim was about darkness and light. They had no problem with Torah as wisdom. They had no problem with mitzvahs as moral code. They had a problem with Ashkicham Teiresecha Lavira Mechuke Ritzeinecha, the Teiresecha, that it was divine, that it was a power of the divine. That's where they had an issue. So their battle was a spiritual battle. They were not interested in killing the Jews. Purim, the Levush writes, was an attack and against the goof of Yisrael. Haman wanted to destroy the Jews physically, Rahman al-Islam, God forbid. Chanukah was an attack on the neshama, and the neshama is captured in light. Ner Hashem nishmas Adam, the soul of a human being is the flame of God, and that's what their battle was. The divine flame, the divine connection of our Torah and mitzvahs. So their battle was Aruchnizdik, was on the neshama of Eden, as the Levush writes. And therefore the main mitzvah, even though there's other aspects to Hanukkah and so on, and the tefillahs and the other details of the minhagim and customs, but its main mitzvah is by lighting a menorah, by lighting a flame. And when do we light it? When it gets dark. The menorah in the Beis HaMikdash was made up of 7 branches, and it was lit, different opinions, but many opinions in the morning. And Hanukkah is dafke by night, and 8. Because Hanukkah's power is Haneres Alola Einam Betelim Le'elam. The Ramban writes in the Parsha Ba'alescha, he writes that the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash, though it was rededicated in the time of Hanukkah, but then ultimately the second temple was destroyed by the Romans. So that menorah stopped shining and illuminating on an ongoing Ner Tamid. But Haneres Halolu, Hanukkah lights throughout Golus remain burning, designating and symbolizing their eternal power throughout even the darkest moments. And that's symbolized when we light the menorah in the evening. So all you have to do is apply the concept of light and dark, which is a central theme to good and evil, to challenges, to easy times and challenging times. So anything in your life where you can fill in the blanks and say, what is darkness in your life, in your personal life right now? I mean, God should preserve us from any type of darkness, but whether it could be daigas parnasa, concerns about livelihood, it could be concerns about our children, it could be our own psychological and inner demons. We all have our dark crevices, our shadows. And Hanukkah comes to teach that you can illuminate even the darkest shadows. And we light it specifically at night, specifically when it gets dark, to show and symbolize the power of this flame. I remember when we were preparing, I had the schus to prepare some of the ads that were published in the New York Times about different holidays. One was Hanukkah, so I titled it Whispering Flames, based on the Frierdiker Rebbe's statement that darf sich zuhören zu was the Lichterlach erzählen. You have to listen to what the flames tell us, the Hanukkah flames tell us. So using that idea, whispering flames, and it had several messages of what the flames teach us. The idea that it pierces darkness, that even a little light can dispel darkness. The idea that every day you have to add more, Mesiv V'Hilach, we add a flame each night. The idea that the different colors in the flames symbolize different aspects of our lives. Several lessons. The Rebbe circled the word whispering and wrote because the word whispering suggests quiet, subdued. And the Rebbe said it's not b'chashoy, it's not meant to be silent, it's persuminisa. It's about publicizing, which is why the Rebbe initiated and encouraged the lighting of menorahs in public places. So even though, of course, whispering flames was more of a poetic expression, but it can suggest an element of more privacy, a more subdued style, and we had to look for a different name. I think we used Once Upon a Flame. I don't recall right now. And the Rebbe edited pretty extensively the entire ads as well. Other aspects, one more I'll mention, I wrote there that the flames, as the flames change, the hues of the flames change, which is, you see there's blue and there's yellow and there's whitish. So the Rebbe said the hues never change, they flicker. So they don't change, the colors never change. That was one of the other things the Rebbe commented on. So bottom line is, just as a part of the message, that we have a tremendous message here that's not a silent message, it's a loud message in the sense that it's meant to reach us all and everyone about the power of light over darkness. And indeed, that was one of the main arguments that allowed Hanukkah menorahs to be displayed even in public governmental places, because it was not a concept of religion versus church, the separation of church versus state, but rather as the universal message of the power of quality over quantity. Rabim ba'ad ma'atim, that the few dominated over the many. Geberim b'yad chaloshim, the powerful ones dominated by the weaker ones. The power of spirit is more powerful in the world of matter. And materialism signifies everything that is in a darker space. Spirituality and spiritual light is everything that's in a brighter space. And we learn that Yisur Ne'er min ha'cheshech, that it's a natural dominance of light over darkness. All you need is a little light to dispel darkness without any battle. It comes naturally, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya Perek Yud Beis. So the lessons are many to each one of us. All we have to do is apply Hanukkah to your personal life by looking at the areas in life that need more illumination, and look at the Hanukkah menorah and listen to its story. And the story is that's like that flame dominated over the darkness back then when the Hanukkah miracle happened the first time. The same thing, Bayom Mehem Bizman Hazeh, that we honor that and we commemorate and we recreate that same power each Hanukkah. And the Jews have gone through everything we've gone through. Look where we are today. The flames are still burning. And therefore the hope and the confidence that no matter what challenge we have, Hanukkah has that message for us. The Maimorim of Chassidus, of course, elaborate on this in many different details, but that is a summation of Chassidus Applied to Hanukkah. And with that, let's go into the first question, which apropos, let's talk about one type of darkness among many of the psychological and emotional darknesses that people go through, and that's the area of anxiety. So though I've addressed this topic in the past, but clearly we haven't solved the problem yet, so that many people still have anxiety, and it's one of those silent killing forces in our lives. So let me address that. It's a number of questions that came in on this topic. And it's one example of how Hanukkah sends us a message and teaches us something of how to deal with anxiety through the lens of Chassidus. How does Chassidus address human anxiety? How does it differ from conventional psychology's approach? What practical advice does Chassidus offer to someone struggling with anxiety and to others who deal with those who face this challenge? More specifically, here are a few questions. Question number one. There are certain temperaments of individuals that can be more anxious and worried than others. How, as a friend or spouse who is dealing with an anxious person, can we help in a way of applying Chassidus, not in a traditional therapy way? For example, when the person gets stuck in their own reality of anxiety and it's hard to get through to them when they're in that state, do you have advice or a methodology of handling it? Question number two. I once heard a tiny class where the esteemed lecturer described the Nefesh Habamis as 1, narrow-sighted, 2, selfish, 3, worried. Is this the interpretation everyone holds? Can you describe how the neshama is not worried or anxious? It might help me with my anxiety that I'm struggling with. Many thanks. Question number 3. Hello, Rabbi Jacobson. I've been struggling with anxiety for the past few months, sometimes very intense. They are mostly fears of dying, mortality, and the like. When I try to apply logic to them, how they are really pretty irrational, they tend to get stronger. A lot of it centers around bad omens and signs, etc., which I think, at least at those times, are based on Torah. How does this help someone overcome such intense worries and fears? I think this is something a lot of people suffer in silence about, and would help many to address this. Thank you, and keep up this incredible shlichus. A fourth question, which is related, and I'll comment as well when I comment on all the questions. My therapist has taught me the practice of mindfulness as a way of dealing with my anxiety. Practically, this means spending 5 minutes a few times a day just focusing in a detailed way on my breathing. But there's more. There's the mindfulness lifestyle, which she recommends. This means always being present as we walk, always noticing the smells, the sounds, the colors. I have some doubts as to whether this is the proper lifestyle for a Yid. Since you're focusing, number one, since you're focusing only on the Gashmis, this seems like it's a life of Klippa. 2, we know that it says in Pirkei Avos that if you stop and appreciate the trees instead of learning as you walk, this is considered a grave sin. On the other hand, it does make sense to stay present with my wife and children. So basically, I'm confused. I see good in the mindful lifestyle, but I see some bad as well. Can you help? Okay. So among the many, many, many answers that the Rebbe has written to people, and there are many in the Igros Kodesh, personal answers, in Yechidus and so on, there's one central theme, Hesach Hadas, that the more you focus, as one writer writes, on your issues, on your nightmares, on whatever it is that you're afraid of, the worse it gets. Hesach Hadas doesn't mean emptying your mind, period. There's no such thing as a mind that can be empty. The mind is a wheel that's always turning. So it means taking your mind and placing it in other areas. So anxiety is an energy. It's an energy that you're exerting in concentrating or focusing on, or over focusing on, exaggerating on, whatever it may be. The way to replace that is to fill your mind and your thoughts and feelings with something that's positive, with the equal power that much as anxiety exerts. And you see this again and again in the Rebbe's answers. To use the Hanukkah example, let's take Hanukkah. When you see light and darkness, it's not like fire and water. Light and darkness, fire and water are two opposites. Enough fire can evaporate the largest bodies of water. Enough water can extinguish the greatest fire. So they're like at war with each other, and you see it. You see when fire and water meet, it crackles and so on until you see who wins and dominates. When it comes to light and darkness, on the other hand, they're no match for each other. Darkness is the absence of light. You put a little light with darkness, no matter how much darkness, that area will be illuminated effortlessly, without any battle, without any war. The Alter Rebbe brings this, as I mentioned before, in chapter 12 in Tanya, to explain the pasuk Yisuna er min acheshech, ki yisuna chochma min asichlis. Is ki yisuna er min acheshech, v'ri'isi sheyesh yisuna chochma min asichlis. Let's say it correctly. Ki yisuna er min acheshech. Shlomo HaMelech in Hakhel says, I've seen the advantage of wisdom over folly, like the advantage of light over darkness. And the Alter Rebbe explains that chochma, for the nefesh halakis, wisdom, has the power, moyech shalat alalev, to naturally dominate over the folly and the impulsiveness of the animal soul. Anxiety falls into that category. So we have the ability, if we wish, to apply ourselves to something positive, and that will inevitably push away the darkness. What do we focus on that's positive? You have to find something that is really you're passionate about. I was reading one note that just came my way recently, and I think it's a very powerful answer from the Rebbe. He's writing to seems to be a teenager who's complaining on their situation and the fact that nobody seems to be helping them. And I'll just translate the Rebbe. The Rebbe says, Kenida Mekol Hanal. From everything you're writing, it's obvious that you're missing Le'esata up till this moment. The Nekuda Ikris, the bottom line, the punchline, the key point. And that's the true cause for your situation. And that is, you write and elaborate on what has happened to you. All the anger that you have, of all the people that are not trying to help you and they should help you. But you don't mention one word Eina masker af mila achas. You don't mention word. Ma osir b'peil l'te'eles ma moshe shel acherim. What have you done in actuality to help in a real, tangible way others? In b'meshach kol yemei chayev, throughout your entire life. Mashamav l'yesa, what's even more shocking and disturbing, that from the way you write, that you don't even feel that you're responsible. It's as if that you're responsible to help anybody else. And the Rebbe elaborates more about this detail. But you see from a point here, it's a very strong note, but you see the point, and I saw it also elsewhere where the Rebbe says that when you cannot help but become anxious, focus on why you're here. What's the purpose of your life? You're here to help others, not to help yourself. Self-focus is always a recipe for disaster when it comes to these type of matters. Frankly, all matters. So the exact opposite thing that most people who are anxious want to do is like bury themselves under a blanket, or just isolate themselves. No, you have to pick yourself up, and since there's some of these questions, if you know someone that's in that state, and bring light into the picture. If you don't bring light, darkness cannot be dispelled just by willing it away, not with weapons, not with anything else. You must bring some light, a little light. Can you solve the problem all in one shot? Ma'at agarashena. It's a slow process, but step by step. The first step to reverse the suffocating tentacles of anxiety is to bring a drop of light, which means to focus on something positive. And the easiest way is to help other people, as the Rebbe writes in this note. So that's one thing. Obviously, some people are in a situation where they get into the throes of anxiety, and I always have to qualify. I'm not talking about clinical depression, where you may need to have the intervention of medical intervention. We're talking about something that isn't the power of a human being, is to focus on the positive, as the Alter Rebbe also later in Perek Chavovanan talks, of course, about atzvus, which is a form of anxiety, if you call it depression, anxiety, but it definitely weakens you and demoralizes you, and the key is not to allow that to become a force. And the way to do it is to focus always on the positive elements. Now, I know it's easier said than done, but that's what Chassidus is here. It tells us, first of all, what is supposed to be done, and then we have to work on it. And Hanukkah, again, is a lesson. So as you're watching the Hanukkah candles and flames burn, think of that. There's a perfect application of how the flames can teach us a lesson like this, just like the flame dispels the darkness. In lighting some way your neshama should do something positive for other people is a powerful way to do this. The same thing is with other passions. Any area of life that you find that gives you some type of contentment, like, let's say, music, art, or just taking a walk, or doing something, anything positive, that's the counter force, is a form of light that challenges the darkness of anxiety. As far as what Chassidus teaches that's unique, this is what's unique. You see, the bottom line, Chassidus believes in the dominance of the soul over matter, the soul over the body. That bottom line, nishmose ikar, that the Alter Rebbe explains in chapter 32, that yes, the yisun er min acheshach, the chokhmah of the nefesh halikis is naturally more dominant. This psychology, secular psychology, does not have, number one, the authority, number two, the confidence to believe in that type of absoluteness. And that's a critical element when you fight any battle. If you have any doubt that you can win the war, or you think that darkness is equal to light, that your so-called negative nature can be as powerful as your positive nature, that your animal soul is as powerful as your divine soul, that alone, even that consideration, makes you weaker. You have to have absolute confidence, and that's what Chassidus tells us, that the neshama has the power to overcome any challenge, any darkness. That confidence, the singing a victory song, a victory march, even before you go to the first battle, meaning that firm belief that you can get through anything, is a tremendous asset in any form of healing, even on a medical and psychological level. That's one thing that Chassidus adds. In addition, understanding that atzvus, or anxiety, whatever name we give for it, is a voice, is a force of the nefesh habamis, the Yetzer Hara, trying to stop us from achieving what we have to achieve. That's a second point. And then finally, the intervention itself. Once you have that absolute confidence, and you know that's the reason it was sent, as the Alter Rebbe explains later in the Chofs in Tanya, the Chavov and so on. It explains this idea, then you recognize that this is exactly why you were sent here, to have this battle. And anxiety is one of the parts of the battle that come from that place. Another final thing I want to say about this is, sometimes a way to put it is this way: anxiety does not exist in heaven. Neshamas without gufim don't have anxiety. There's no anxiety of an unhealthy sort in heaven. There may be a certain searching and yearning to reach higher levels, but the anxiety that we refer to only exists down on earth. And in a certain way, anxiety, one of the ways I often describe it, is a voice of your soul. Your soul saying, I'm hungry. Your body tells you it's hungry through birth, through hunger pangs, or through other voices and through other ways of recognizing that you're hungry. How does your soul tell you when it's hungry? You become anxious. Anxious means that there's some imbalance. There's some imbalance of something that your soul needs that you're not feeding it with. And if you don't nourish and nurture your soul, it will come back to bite you. And anxiety is one expression of that. So that's exactly what we need to focus on, to recognize that this is a wake-up call. Just like pain, no one wants pain, but pain is a wake-up call that reminds us and warns us there's a problem. Anxiety is a reminder that there's some imbalance. And that imbalance means your soul needs nourishment. And you will not satisfy it with some material, short-term, instant gratification. Okay, so we have the lesson of Hanukkah on that topic. Let's now move over to some follow-ups, and then as well as cover some new topics as well. So of course, first let me deal with a simpler one, so to speak. I don't know how simple it is, but it's easier to talk about, less controversial. And that is about the Alter Rebbe's mikveh. Last week, in last episode, I was talking about the chidushim, talking about in context of Yutas Kislev and the Alter Rebbe, how the Alter Rebbe, the question was about minhagim and nusach hatfilah, how Chabad customs work. And I explained that the Alter Rebbe wrote a Shulchan Aruch on the instructions of the Magid, Shulchan Aruch, that took obviously the Beis Yosef and the Ramah, and prior to that the Tur, and prior to that the Rambam and all the codifiers, and brought it to a more contemporary state, just like the Beis Yosef did to the Tur, with dealing also with the Rishonim and the Achreinim and the additional elements that the Alter Rebbe adds, and of course going over it again presents ideas, and it's tremendous to see the comparison of the Alter Rebbe to the previous Shulchan Aruch. Obviously, it's more common, more similarities than differences, but yet the nuances and the applications and the spelling out of things that are so relevant to us. And I mentioned at the same time the Alter Rebbe's chidushim, and I alluded to that there were the three main chidushim, which I'm going to elaborate a little more upon now, that he did, that he himself referred to before the Istalkus of the Alter Rebbe, before Chavdal Tevis, to the three main contributions he made in the area of Minhagi Yisrael, customs of Yidden, mitzvahs you could say. And one of them was about the mikveh. So I spoke quickly, and here was the question that was asked. Alter Rebbe mikveh. Kindly shine some light on the topic of the takana, if that is how it should be stated, concerning the Alter Rebbe mikveh. It was somehow my understanding that the Alter Rebbe gave us a war mikveh, the Rebbe Rashab gave us boir al gabe boir, a pit above a pit. And that's absolutely correct. I mentioned pit on top of pit in the name of the Alter Rebbe. I stand corrected. That's not what I wanted to say, nor is it accurate. But understanding there's a context, which I didn't have the time, and I should have probably elaborated more, which I want to do now, on the whole context. So the Tzemach Tzedek, in Beis Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek writes, let me correct myself. In Beis Rebbe he mentions, and the Tzemach Tzedek also states the same thing, I'm just using here from the Tzemach Tzedek in his Tshuvas on Yedid Day, and we'll soon get to the Takanos HaMikveh, he mentions, Nishma Memenu, the Tzemach Tzedek, we heard from him, Shehispire, the Alter Rebbe was actually proud that he was misaken the mikvois, which is absolutely called Takonos HaMikveh, that's the way the Alter Rebbe calls it, that it should be able to be used warm. And he says, Kumedumali sheshamaytim ishnem, and Tzemach Tzedek writes, I recall, or I think that I heard from a reliable source, that in his journey, before his Astalkusei, that this was one of three things that he hitkin, who zal b'chayev zchusei yagen aleinu. Three things that the Alter Rebbe established. It doesn't say specifically the three things, but also in Beis Rebbe, chapter Yud, they also talk about three things. And what we have found in different manuscripts, that it's most likely the three things that is the takana about mikveh, which I'll address in a moment, the sakinim ulutashim, which is the double-edged blade on a sakin for shchita, and number three, laharbe is bizdaka. As you see in Ageres HaKedes, especially, the Alter Rebbe was extremely focused on the increase in tzedakah, which reserves its own discussion that this is one of the three things that the Alter Rebbe, so-called contributor, was proud of, in the words of the Tzemach Tzedek. We'll elaborate on that another time, but I want to go back to the mikveh. So what is the chiddush of the Alter Rebbe? I need a little background. And this has been documented already in different various sources. There's Rabbi Levin wrote a sefer called Tikkunim Mikvois Lefi Takonos Rabbeinu, and there are others have written both in Hebrew and in English a collection on the whole history of mikveh, and especially the Alter Rebbe's chiddush Rebbe, literally a chiddush for all Klal Yisrael. And here you see one of the places the Alter Rebbe touched that didn't just affect Chassidic Chabad, but all Jews. Till the Alter Rebbe, you can basically say most of the mikvois for Tara were essentially what used mostly were either a mayan or a nor. Primarily a mayan, a live spring, because that's the safest and the most halachically acceptable Tara. As soon as you get to a river, there's also a bunch of issues with rivers, whether they're connected or they're not connected. I won't go into that right now. As far as a body of water, of rainwater, that would just stay mem sa, as what we are so familiar with, even though that was allowed, but it became a situation where you simply, the water would become stale, and it was simply impossible to go into it. To mix other water into it is a whole question of mayim she'uvim, which means you can't draw water in a mikveh. Okay? There's another second issue that a mikveh can be a keli. It can't be a human container that we create and just hold water there. So there was a big problem. In the warmer countries, it was one thing, because the warmer countries, you can go to a mayan, to a spring, and it's manageable. But in the colder countries, it was literally ice water. And even if you could throw in some hot water, how long would it last? It's a live spring. The cold water would immediately be frozen, which created the nisayon of many people having the difficulty of going to the mikveh. And even when they went, they couldn't do all the perfect type of tefillah that's necessary, the type of immersion necessary according to all the days. So there's all kinds of discussion on this in Sfarim. I just want to say in context of our discussion here, the Alter Rebbe, in a fascinating feat of engineering, and he writes in the Shulchan Aruch in the Yeridea, he has a whole written up manuscript that's printed. With the Tzemach Tzedek now we have, the Tzemach Tzedek in his Tshuvas in Yeridea elaborates on it, and he shows with an engineering element how you can actually create a situation where you can build a container near a spring, but it shouldn't be a container, and it should not be mayim shuvim. And that was with the ingenious concept of creating a hole that's big enough to allow the water from the spring to come in, but then sealing the edges to allow it to only go in slowly so you could keep it warm for a while. Enough to be able to initiate and create a mikveh that was more manageable. The details I'm not going to go into here. They're far more complicated than this platform allows. And bottom line is that's what the Alter Rebbe initiated. As a matter of fact, after the Alter Rebbe's Istalkus and the time in Lubavitch, the Mittler Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, built a mikveh according to these standards. It may be the first one in Lubavitch. The problem was the Alter Rebbe's solution is a correct solution, l'chol hadeis, to the point that the Chassam Sofer, who was against almost any type of mikveh they were trying to create because of all its questions, said this is l'chatchila allowed, the Alter Rebbe's method. The problem was, from a point of view logistically, it was too deep down because it had to be too close to the spring, a live spring of water. So the Tzemach Tzedek came up with an innovation using pipes, which were new inventions at the time that would still allow to have all the strength of the Alter Rebbe's innovation, as well as being more accessible. Then what happened, of course, was as time passed, you couldn't always build mikvahs near Mayan, near a spring. When the Rebbe Rashab moved to Rostov, and the Rebbe Rashab was very against mikvahs that were based on rainwater because of all the questions and shilas. When he moved to Rostov, there was no choice because now, due to the war, you couldn't just go anywhere you want. And there was the question of a mikveh. So that's when the Rebbe Rashab came up with boyer al gaba boyer, which was using rainwater, not the spring water, live spring water, rainwater, and how you can still have it in a way that it's not a keli, and it's still connected, and it has all the elements that are not metame, and it's not mayim shuvim, which again is not the scope of this discussion, but correct. I'm discussing more at length. But the Alter Rebbe was the one that went in, and that innovation, which was the main point of what I discussed last week. Okay, enough said about this, and we'll talk about the other two takanas of the Alter Rebbe at another time, because there's quite no question, especially the Harbis L'Zdaka sounds like a tremendous theme of what the Alter Rebbe actually innovated, and definitely could use more research of how tzedakah could be that the Alter Rebbe is the one that actually pioneered the revolution of charity that we see today in the modern world. The Alter Rebbe was his chiddush. He was then would be the first one that actually created a new movement that ultimately would overtake also the non-Jewish world. But let's move on to the next follow-up. The next follow-up is the topic of Messianism or Meshichism, however you want to say it. I don't like either of those words, but there's no other way to identify it, so let's talk about that. Now you can imagine this topic elicited many, many heated comments, no surprise there, about whether those claiming and declaring the Rebbe as Mashiach and other type of behavior like that, whether it furthers or whether it's furthering or detracting from the Rebbe's mission. So I said what I said, and I will read now what a few people wrote, some in total disagreement, or at least initially seems like a disagreement, then I will try to then elaborate on it. Okay. Dear Rabbi Jacobson, Shlita, I watched your latest episode about Messianism with great interest. You disagreed wholeheartedly with the questioner. You maintain that Chabad Messianism has not harmed Chabad or destroyed the Rebbe's work in any way. With due respect, I don't know what world you are living in. I was raised in a Litvish home, learned in Litvish yeshivas, and even though I became Chabad in my youth, I have maintained strong connections with my friends from those days. Due to the Messianic campaign, promoting the Rebbe as Mashiach, covering 770 with flags and banners, and all that the campaign entails, that part of Chabad is unfortunately viewed like a cult. In fact, most of Chabad are viewed with great suspicion. Please do not assume that this is only by Misnagdim or the so-called Litvish B'nai Torah, but even by many easygoing and non-judgmental people, and also by fellow Chassidim. Maybe in Crown Heights you are not exposed to people telling you this to your face, but believe me, Chabad is viewed with suspicion, and a lot of normal, regular people do not trust Lubavitchers to have normal hashkafas, viewpoints. My son recently went to Kfar Chabad with a group of Bochum from a Litvish yeshiva. They genuinely wanted to see. He told me that the array of Yechi flags hanging out of cars and buildings, and the pronouncing of Yechi after davening in 4 shuls they visited scared them off. Nice people, they said, but scary like a cult, whose sole aim is to convince them that it is a chiyuv to identify who's the Mashiach, and brought twisted logic that it can only be the Rebbe. This was the conversation of many people they met over Shabbos. Is this what the Rebbe wanted? How can you deny the irrefutable? I challenge you to make an honest survey from 1,000 people across the spectrum, not to our brothers who are not yet frum, they are uninitiated, but from any frum people from any group. I believe that most will tell you that Lubavitchers as a group, not individuals they may know, but as a group have a terrible name due solely to the Meshachisten. And then he goes on to say about the 10 resolutions of the recent Meshachist Kinus HaShluchim. He says there's no mention made there in all their resolutions of Kfiyas Yitam L'Teira, of Mekiyam Mitzvahs Behidur, davening Ba'aveda, B'tfilah B'kavon and B'tzibur, to be Mahadir Mitzvah, to improve one's midas, Chinuch Habonim, to be honest and straight, Kedusha Seinayim, etc. It is late, very late, but not too late for the Chabad Rabbanim to stop this plague once for all, to re-educate our youth on what is important and what is cultish and outlandish. To be balanced Chassidish Yungalite, not stalling on the wrong things and destroying our Rebbe's good name and legacy. Please forgive me, I don't mean to insult you. I mean it in earnest. It pains me on a daily basis, but my experiences have taught me that everything I have written is unfortunately true. If you wish to reply to me by email, please do not feel obliged, but if you wish, to my address, and I get this person's address. Okay. That was one. Another. Feedback. I searched your archives and found you write about this topic. Why can't you say that in private? You can say if you feel it, and it helps your iskashus of the Rebbe in public. When the one will hear Yechi, may be confused, turned up. Why can you not say it in private for yourself? What is your opinion about whether Chabad Chassidim should be saying Yechi after davening or events? What is your opinion about publicizing to the masses, not only to Chabad Chassidim, that the Rebbe is Mashiach, like pictures on mitzvah tanks with picture of the Rebbe and the statement Mashiach is here? And then there are more questions in the same spirit, and I don't think I have to read them all, but they are basically challenging what I said last week, and I'm always looking if there are any supporting statements. It's all right. Not that I need that right now. It's fine. But so let me address this. If you recall what I've said, and I reiterate, I do not suggest that everything being done is appropriate, and that everything being done is mekarev or appealing to others. I suggest that we have to look at the emes, because Teres emes and Chassidus is all about emes. Emes is defined to us not by your feelings or my feelings, whether we understand them or not. Yes, it may be very convenient to cut out from Yiddishkeit things like turning a chicken over your head, or taking 4 species because they may seem weird to some people. And there were actually Jews, unfortunately, who said certain mitzvahs simply are outlandish, in your words. So the key here is to understand what is emes and how you present emes, both those things. Because you could also have something that's true, but presented in the wrong way, in a way that either insults or offends or turns off people or confuses people. So I believe I said all that, and I think anyone listening to these episodes knows my approach to this. It's not my approach, it's what I learned from the Rebbe and we learned from Chassidus. But we have to remember that we have to distinguish between our feelings on something and what is true. That's one point I want to make. A second point I want to make is, unfortunately, the politics. The politics, which I don't like to address at all in this forum at all, because the Chassidus doesn't address politics, but we cannot deny the fact, and you'll find it many times in notes from the Rebbe, that people have politicized this topic. Without going into names, without going into details, very often the conflicts about this issue have nothing to do with ideology, with Torah, not Teres emes or Chassidus. It has to do mibaresh. People identify with different individuals and therefore identify with their approach. Or the other way around. Because they don't identify with others, they identify with those that have a different approach, which has nothing to do with Torah, not halacha. I always tell people, both within Chassidus Chabad, within Chassidic Chabad, outside of Chassidic Chabad, secular people who are interested in this topic, we have a Torah that was given at Har Sinai. It is the only arbiter, the only decision maker, not me, not the listeners, not all these writers that make decisions what is Torah, what is not Torah. Part of it is that in Teres emes it says, and it's a ikar namuna, that Mashiach will come. It is also a yesod that Mashiach will be a basar v'dam and not an angel. It also, we know there's criteria for this Mashiach. I don't see any issue with somebody following that and identifying someone that may fit the bill. The question now is how to do it and what should be done, what shouldn't. No question imposing something on others, and definitely doing something that people are confused by, or worse, turned off by, is a very critical component. The Rebbe spoke about that many times. You could say everything that's true, but you're turning people off, obviously. Why did I not start with that? Because I wanted to focus on action. All these letters, you may all have good points, and I'm not going to go point by point, discuss every aspect. You say that people have been turned off. I believe you have no reason not to. So the question is, what do you want to do? Now, go to war against anyone that does that, or come out with even a stronger voice of what Mashiach means, what Jews should believe, and more importantly, what we should do b'chai yem yem right now. Yes, k'viyas itl netera, tefillah b'tzibur b'kavona, kima mitzvahs b'hider. All the elements, and do it with such a passion that it so overshadows anyone else's efforts that anyone that does something that's either shtuyat, which is nonsense, or doing it in ways that are wrong, or even the message is wrong, and even the content is wrong, it will be overshadowed by the positive surge of all of us putting together our strengths and energies. That's what I would like to focus on. For me to start going, and anyone started going, fine, you want to begin to vilify and begin to demonize everybody that's doing things that are inappropriate? Yeah, you know something? We live in a world where a lot of people doing things inappropriate. I don't know if Meshachistan is the biggest crime in existence, even though it may cause damage, as pointed out. But if you really care about Yiddishkeit, that's what they used to always say. People line up to criticize. If you really care, where are you when we need you to touch every Jew? Where are you when we have 10% of Jewish children are going to schools, to Jewish education, where assimilation is so rampant? So I'm not suggesting that what you're writing is wrong, but I'm suggesting where to put our energies. Now, by all means, if you can find a way to neutralize, some way to minimize. People are saying things that are not based on Torah. The best way to say is everything is Torah. Chabad, Chassidus, everything from the Rabbeim, every iota is Teres emes. And that's all that matters. Anyone that doesn't follow that Teres Emes is off the reservation. Who cares what they claim, what they don't claim? We have sikhs from the Rebbe, they're published. As someone who worked in the sikhs, I can tell you, one of the most important things for the Rebbe was everything had a footnote. Even Bereshis Aleph Aleph, which everyone knows, Genesis 1:1. Who doesn't know where it says Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz? Then beginning God created heaven and earth. Everyone knows what it says. Once it was missing, and Tov Shem Amal, the Rebbe had a Fabrengen and was literally yelling about it. How could you miss Bereshis Aleph Aleph? Everything has to have a footnote. And when Chassidus and the Rabbeim want to say something that they say a pshat, they'll say v'yesh leimer b'derech efsher. Everything has a source. And that's how we have to focus. Anyone that cannot provide a source or has some hergish and they want to do it in their own privacy, first of all, that's their business. Second of all, if you ask them, yes, we should be able to ask everybody for a source. So I go again, I actually deal mostly with the secular world. So I can tell you there's no damage done because they, as you allude to, one of the writers here, they don't even know about the whole thing. I remember once a journalist wanted to do a story on Chabad, so he decided he's coming here to Crown Heights. So I told him, why don't we meet Sukkos? I thought Sukkos would be a good time, Simchas Beis HaShe'eva, dancing and so on. No, he decides to come on his terms, a smart guy, skeptic. He decides to come, Leil Erev Yom Kippur. Midnight, he heard about Kaporos, he comes, goes to President Street, he sees the Kaporos. I don't know if you ever saw the scene. Okay. He looks, so I say, he calls me on the cell phone, he says, I'm here, I'm on President Street, I'm seeing all the Kaporos. On Eastern Park, I remember where it was exactly. So I come to meet him, he's looking, he's smiling to me, he says to me, they have a problem with the Rebbe being Mashiach. I have a much bigger problem with this at midnight, slaughtering these chickens. And he says, pointed one to me that was like running around, unfortunately. He says, this is like pagan, And I remember thinking to him, we all started laughing, thinking to myself, if you talk from the secular point of view, they look at much of Yiddishkeit without explanation looks what's strange. So what are we going to do? Obviously, I don't know if it should be done in public on President Street or Eastern Parkway, but at the same time, we're not ashamed. You have to explain. Mashiach happens to be something that's quite easy to explain. The whole world wants a world peace. Everybody wants a higher spiritual consciousness, a world that will be, in the words of the Rambam, a world that will see materialism as simply a means to a higher end, and all that comes with that. A world of no famine, and all of that. You have to explain it. And the fact that just like a Moshe Rabbeinu led the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim and through the wilderness, a Moshe Rabbeinu, Goel Rishon, who Goel Achron, will lead the Jews and the world out of Golus, a visionary of the highest order. This is difficult to explain. Not at all. It's one of the easiest things to explain in my experience. But it's become so fraught with politics and with animosity. And yes, with people doing destructive things that could be destructive. But the way to reverse this, in my opinion, is to get into the constructive mode in a far more proactive fashion, and that will overshadow anything else. But you have to really be committed to do that. It's far easier to condemn others. I want to add one more thing, which I don't like to talk about, but I will mention it. I'm not a young man. I remember before Meshachistan was an issue, that many people in many circles always saw Chabad as suspicious. Whether it was because of they thought the Messianic beliefs or other things, sleeping in a sukkah and andere Sachen. So you have to let's also qualify that there are individuals, more than just a few, that have poisoned even neutral people who are good people with a certain suspicion about Chassidus in general and others. Again, this doesn't justify anyone doing anything inappropriate. I'm not justifying it at all, but I just wanted to throw that into the equation. If you're really going to be fully thorough, let's talk about all the angles here. And going back to the point is, we have directives from the Rebbe, from the Rabbeim, Okay. Next question. Let's see. Over this. Mimicking the Rebbe. Yeah. Interesting follow-up to that. Is there any basis for mimicking the Rebbe? Can you please discuss the new fad of mimicking the Rebbe like a parrot, including Hanukkah, hat size and type shoes, eating matzah during year, black tie, suspenders? There's a sikh of the Rebbe Rashab in Teir Shalom, I think, Samach Tes against Chitzenius. Chitzenius means superficial externals. The Chlal Chassidim were never into Chitzenius, Mechze Kiyura, to just show off through your look. But we see that Spitz Chassidim do it. meaning mimicking. Okay, well, let's start first always on the positive end. The positive end, yes, you do find Abtarfen, and the Gemara the Rebbe brings with Hadassim, that he with certain Hadassim that he saw in his teacher, and the students saw in him, and they mimicked it, so to speak, even though that was what their teacher, they followed his custom. Even though the Hadassim were somewhat questionable in other people's opinion. So you have the concept of Talmidim, because of their iskashus and their connection to a Rebbe or to a teacher, will follow his custom, not always because they hold by it, not always because they thought about it, but because there's a certain love, just like some of us do things that our fathers did, or our parents and grandparents did, even though we may not fully have thought it through, because it became our custom. So I think it's important just, first of all, to lower the so-called temperature about this, to realize there is that element. Now, of course, everything in moderation. When it gets to extremes, in both extremes, where mimicking is the only thing a person is doing, and anything that's an ikka that the Rebbe is doing, they're not doing, that, of course, becomes not just bizarre, but in a way a major distortion. Someone was once by the Rebbe, brought the Rebbe, I believe, a manuscript of Maimorim, which was always very precious by the Rebbe. And the Rebbe said, since you brought me something so precious to me, what can I give you, something that would be precious to you? So he said, this was an American boy, and he said, I'd like to have, what Americans want, he wants to have a souvenir. So he said he'd like to have a picture of the Rebbe with the Rebbe's signature. What you see, celebrities, sports heroes, and so on. So the Rebbe smiled and said, why do you want that? He says, I want to be connected to you in some way. The Rebbe said, you want to be connected to me? Do what I do. Learn what I learn. Behave like I behave. Go over to across the street, and you can get any sfarim you like there, any books that from myself or from my predecessors. So you want to mimic the Rebbe. We're not going to get into Pnimius and Chetzenis. Let's start with mimicking the Rebbe's Midas Tevis, Derech Eretz, respect for his parents, respect for his mother. As we saw, every day go visiting a man like so busy going to see his mother for a few minutes. Hundreds of other examples in Poshet Menschlichkeit and behavior. That's where the mimicking should begin. You don't hold by it? Like the Alter Rebbe said once to a group of non-Chassidim who said, look, your Chassidim, they're hypocrites. They daven long, they do this, they don't hold by it. So the Alter Rebbe smiled and said, may it be Mekuyim than the words of the Mishnah, Meruba Midateva. Later explaining what Mishnah was he talking about, the Mishnah says that a wealthy person masquerades like a poor person, like a pauper, ultimately he'll become a pauper. So Alter Rebbe is saying, Meruba Midateva, how much more so on the positive? When someone who's not holding by a certain spiritual level, a certain pious level, behaves like that, the behavior will ultimately lead them to there. And we can explain this in many ways. That a behavioral by Judaism, like the Rambam Paskins and Sof Hilchos Gerish and Sof Perek Beis, says that that's what the Jew really wants. So it's behavioral, is just exposing the real Jew. So the same thing here. Mimic the Rebbe in these inyanim. The Chitzenius in clothing or other things, obviously we all understand is somewhat juvenile, inappropriate. Even though I mentioned before there was a chvivus, and the Rebbe did tell certain Chassidim who became shluchim and so on, and they said, I don't know how to be a Rav. The Rebbe says, copy a real Rav. And they in turn began to copy the Rebbe. Remember, the Rebbe's behavior is the Chayz gehalten al pitera, al pishulchan aruch, al pichsidis, bedugma shel mayla. So how the Rebbe davened, how the Rebbe bent down, how the Rebbe's menhagim. Chassidim always were very meticulously careful to see the Rebbe's behavior in order to learn menhagim. Obviously, if it's only externals and it's missing the whole neshama and pnimius, we all understand it's a distortion. But to just completely dismiss it, I don't want to because of the reasons I mentioned. But it has to be everything in moderation and balance. And at the end of the day, ponim in Judaism, ponim means a face, but a face can be a face in the surface. In English, the face of something, the surface of something, does not mean that's the inside. In Hebrew, however, ponim also means pnim. Means your inside, teiche kibari, your inside is like your outside, and your outside is like your inside. That's the kavanah of Chassidus. That the outer should express the inner. Sometimes we begin with behavioral change, and that leads to inner change. If it just becomes some type of like childish mimicking or parroting, obviously, as I said what I said, with all the qualifications. Okay. Understanding Hakhel is the next question. What is the significance of Hakhel? The Rebbe told many people what to do in Hakhel. What exactly does that mean? There's the Yechidus where the Rebbe was literally told everybody, ton in Hakhel, so ton in Hakhel. Everyone that came by the dollars. Aren't we already gathering Jews for many reasons, many different reasons? Do we just gather as we usually do and just give it a title, Hakhel? So for example, I make a Shabbos party with children of my own. Or sometimes with other kids too. Do I do the same psukim nash story and just tell the kids this is Hakhel, or do I need to be doing something else? Question number 2. Please, can you talk about Hakhel? I don't really get Hakhel. Don't we anyway make gatherings of Jews? We make rallies, Messiah Shabbos, Shiurim, holiday events. So what exactly is Hakhel to gather more often? Well, if you look at the sichos of the Rebbe, and I mentioned them earlier this year, Tov Shem Mem Ches was the last Hakhel, the Rebbe with us till this point, and then Tov Shem Mem Aleph. It wasn't just gathering. Obviously, the concept of gathering, a communal gathering, is a part of Judaism. Yakel Kehilas. Moshe designated that Jews should gather together. We learn Torah together, we daven together, we have rallies, we have Mordechai gathered the children, and he said the Nikolai Yehudim, the Jews should gather together. This is a way that we pray together, we get strength, the synergy of a group, and so on. So we know the power. Hakhel was once every 7 years. So first let's start with that. When the Beis HaMikdash, the Melech, they'd build a bima, the Melech would get up and would read from Torah. To what? To add Yiras Shamayim that would last an entire lifetime. You could say, 1 second, reading Torah and adding Yiras Shamayim, you have all year round. But yet there's a year where there's that mitzvah. So even though it's the theme of Judaism in general, but there are times that are more conducive and more powerful. As we know, a time is energy. So the year Hakhel has more ability and more strength to give us the ability to unite Anoshim, Noshim, V'taf, men, women, and children, of course in appropriate halachic ways, and to unite in what? In reconnecting and dedicating our lives to the Eibishter, the Torah, and so on. So though today we don't have the mitzvah, but the ruchnius of it remains. So you could say the same thing about Sukkot. We dance on Sukkot, so Simchas Be'Shevet. Isn't Simcha all year round? Yes, Simcha is all year round. Even though Hashem B'Simcha. Right? Tev Lev Mishta Tamid. You should always be happy. But there are times that becomes the shar, the gate, which is the main emphasis. So Hakhel is a year where we have more power and more ability to unite, and people will respond to it in a greater way. And it's a beautiful gift because we live in a lonely world, existential loneliness, the separation that people suffer from. We're talking about the injustices, people not being able to be one with each other. We live in a world where we need this more than ever, in homes, in families, in communities, in schools, at work. So the Rebbe suggests a whole series of suggestions. I already referred to the sichos of Tov Shem Mem Ches, Shabbos Parshas, and Bereshis, and Yud Gimel Tishrei, those sichos, the beginning of Sefer HaSichos Tov Shin Nun Mem Ches, where the Rebbe speaks about all the suggestions wherever possible to create these Hakhels, and we will be matzliach as you see people who gather people together in that way, have that type of atzlacha. So number 1 this year is, yes, a special year for this. Therefore, we can and should do it in a more powerful way. Number 2, there's a Hakhel here that's more unique than general because of the effect on Anoshim, Noshim, and Taf, all segments of the Jewish people. And in addition to that, Hakhel is, of course, Kol Godel Yeshuva Hena, which may be one of the reasons that Rebbe underscored it, because Mashiach comes, you say, Kol Godel Yeshuva Hena. A great community, the great Hakhel, the great Kol, will return. That will be the significance of Mashiach. So in a world where we see an increasing growth of unity in science, in technology, in so on, it's an excellent opportunity to just apply that to the final frontier, which is the unity in our own homes and communities. And let's be honest, one of the great challenges we have is sinas chinam, baseless hatred, divisiveness. Hakhel is the perfect antidote to that. So what better time than in a year like this? And yes, everything you mentioned in your letter should be done, but even with more emphasis, both in quantity and in quality. Let me go over to one more question, and then to the Chassidus question and to the essays. How to respond when non-frum relatives question the value of a yeshiva education that has no secular studies, or even the girls' school's English, which is only half-day and thus not sufficient in their minds. So there's 2 parts to any question like this. Number 1 is what is the answer, and number 2, how to respond. The answer is, in the best possible way to express it briefly, is this. The Torah was given by God to this world, to human beings, and we are zeicha to learn it because it teaches us a blueprint for life, how to be the best possible human beings, the best possible Jews, the most mentioned, the people that can bring moral and virtue awareness to the entire world. That's what the Torah is. Lasei tzedakah mishpat. So when we build yeshivas and schools to teach that, you're teaching the moral spine, the moral the foundation to all life. Without that, we'll just have a jungle. That's what the yeshiva comes to do. It's more than just knowledge of the tool chest of how to make a living and how to use hammers and nails, and for that matter, all the sciences, the physical and the physical sciences, the social sciences, and the political sciences. These are tools how to function in this world. But why we are here and the purpose of our existence, that's what's taught in the yeshiva. Now you have to find the right way to express that to any Jew, to any person for that matter, especially someone who's not familiar with it. Because their attitude to yeshiva is, limited education. That's not a limited education. It's teaching a person to be a human being, to be a soulful, refined citizen that will change and help the world to become a better place. That's the bottom line of what Torah is. Now you have to find the words, how to say this to the right person. The fact that there is in some schools no focus on the secular is because we have enough schools that teach the secular, we have enough doctors, lawyers, and accountants, and we need soul doctors. We need people to teach people why we're here. Many people know that have excellent tool chests and know how to use those tool chests, which is all the knowledge in the world. But why we're here and how to use it in a moral way, remember, at the end of the day, secular science is amoral, meaning it's morally neutral. It doesn't have anything to say about morality. It's telling you how the world works. It tells you how to master knowledge, how to develop technologies, how to develop systems, programs, how to build a better business, which can also be a very good contributing force to society. But ultimately, the morality that's needed, the soulfulness, that's what the Torah teaches. This is how we have to communicate, especially to people who are not familiar with what Yiddishkeit is, and with confidence and so on. I would not get into a debate. I would definitely make sure to stay away from any type of confrontation and say my way is better than your way. And the contrary, inspire and by example show. Here are my children. Look how they behave. Look how when they make a bracha. Look how they say thank you. And frankly, if you can't do that, then they'll have a very good question. They'll say, so what kind of school is educating children that are animals? God forbid. So that's all part of the picture. You could always say that the yeshiva system doesn't mean it's perfect, but that's what we aspire to, and that's our objective. More can be said of this, but because of time limitations. Let me go over to a question, which I don't believe I can even address fully, but I will begin because it's a very solid and fundamental question, and that is, can you explain the difference between the two opinions in interpreting the Tzimtzum? Literally or not literally? Tzimtzum kipshute or not kipshute? I've also heard that the Rebbe revolutionized the approach to Chassidus to understanding Tzimtzum and perpetual creation by saying that God, who is Kol Yochel, omnipotent, could have created existence via Tzimtzum kipshute, meaning that godliness is literally removed from our reality, and in a way that the universe did not need to be renewed perpetually. Hischatshus b'chol rega v'rega. Indeed, this perspective, held by a number of great sages, seems more logical, explains the Rebbe. The reason that the Alter Rebbe writes otherwise is only due to the fact that the Alter Rebbe received from his teachers that the Tzimtzum is not kipshute and that creation is perpetually renewed, which compelled the Alter Rebbe to explain the concepts in logical terms. Can you elaborate on this and how this idea developed in the Rebbe's teachings? Okay, I will say this is part one of my elaboration because of time limitations. Let me just begin with the first part of the question, and then I'll answer the next part with whatever time allows now, but most likely in the next episode. First of all, the Rebbe says in the famous letter, Tafresh Tzadik Tes, printed in volume 1 in Igris Kodesh. Let's start with the Mara Mekamis. This is a letter to Rabbi the Gaon, the Chassid, Rabbi Rachmiel ben Yominson, Yutesh Shvat Tafresh Tzadik Tes, printed in Igris Kodesh, volume 1, page 19. That there's actually 4 opinions when you really break it down. Yes, generally there are 2. Now he asked the question there that he heard that one of the Rabbi Yominson writes to the Rebbe that one of the people he knows, and the footnote they say that it seems to be Rabbi Eliezer Dessler, right? That all the opinions on Tzimtzum all go in the same direction, and the Rebbe says, I'm very surprised by such a consideration, especially since you're describing that person as someone who's familiar with Sifrei HaMekubalim, because it's obvious that's not at all the case. And the Rebbe goes on to explain 4 different ways to understand the topic. So generally speaking, and in brief, and I will quote more sources as we go along in this topic, generally speaking, the difference is whether there's a tzimtzum in the moyer or in the oyer, which means is there a tzimtzum, the moyer, the source itself, conceal itself, or only the reflection of the source? And number 2, is it a literal tzimtzum or is it not literal? And basically, based on that, there are 4 opinions. Some say in the most extreme it's in the moyer, in the source, and literal. Some say it's in the source but not literal. Others say it's in the reflection but it's literal. And Chassidus Chabad is the fourth opinion, the Alter Rebbe, and the Rebbe brings many sources there, that it's in the reflection and in the lowest levels of reflection and it's not literal. Now what that means is, as the Alter Rebbe of course elaborates in Perek Zayin, Shai Yichud V'Amuna, he says those that made the mistake and said Tzimtzum B'Shuti, because they try to compare the Eibishter to like a body, which means how could he be in a place of unclean place, which is this world? So that's why, so to speak, you have to say the Eibishter is looking at it like an example that Yeshu Levov, the Baal Mishnah Chassidim says, like a king that's looking through the window at waste, at ashpa, at dirt. Because you can't say that he's there. And the Alter Rebbe negates that entire concept. This is going to be part of the further discussion, how the Rebbe understands that Perek Zayin. There is absolutely a chiddush of the Rebbe in it. But let me just, because again, time is limited, let me just explain it briefly. It essentially comes down to the extension. Everyone here holds that this is not coming from a place of Cheder Amunah, God forbid. Whether it was the Baal Mishnah Chassidim or the Gra or other Gedalim, they held from because of the Eibishter greatness. How could you say such greatness exists among the lowly part of this world? Their conclusion, therefore, is that this world, this material world, in some ways cannot connect to God in a direct way. The only way is through negating existence. So obviously they also hold the Hashgach of the Eibishter, and we'll talk again about this in the Rebbe Sichos, that there's some way there's a Hashgach of the Eibishter because they believe that the Eibishter watches us and protects us and so on. However, Atzmus, if you say in the Moyer, in the source, cannot be in this type of place. The second opinion, which is that it's not in the core, but it's in the reflection. Also, the reflection cannot be here. The core perhaps is here because Atzmus is removed from anything, so you can't discuss him in that context. But in some way, you cannot unite this world with Elokus. Tzimtzum, not Kipshute, especially in the opinion of not in the Moyer, but in the Oyer, is teaching us, Chabad, that it's concealed, but it's there. You have to define the godliness in everything. And absolutely, comes to things that are negative, shvirosan zeh takanosan. There are things that have to be broken. You cannot unite, God forbid, a sin, or something that comes from, that's asur, b'yidei achitzenim, asur v'kosher b'yidei achitzenim, with Elokus, without breaking that. But in there's also a spark that can be elevated. So in a certain way, you could say those that hold Tzimtzum Kipshute, or more or less how we think about Klippas. They see the entire world, even the material world, anything, not just Ra, not just evil, as being something that can't ultimately be united. So how do we ultimately experience godliness? By denying it, which maybe is the root of the idea that the whole reason we come to this world is not to refine the world, but to build reward, to go back to Elam Haba and withstand the Nisyanis. That would be the approach of a Tzimtzum Kipshutinik type of thinker. Whereas a Tzimtzum Kipshute is that this world, did to be refined. But the dakas you could, this I've never seen, but I'm just suggesting, that Rambam says that the ultimate reward will be neshamas without gufim, souls without bodies. The Ramban says souls with bodies. The Rambam also says there'll be tchiyas hamesim, but that will be one tkufa, one period, because you have to reward the body for participating in the mitzvahs that a Jew did. But the ultimate reward is because a body is a lowly entity. It cannot really ultimately fully unite with the divine. Nene meziv ashchina. The Ramban holds, and the Tzemach Tzedek writes that the Alter Rebbe paskins like the Ramban, and Mukabolim paskin like the Ramban, that the ultimate reward will be in Tachtenim, in the Dir B'Tachtenim. So not to suggest it's the same disagreement, but al derech zeh, you could see, in other words, the Rambam says this world cannot be a real container for the divine in a perpetual, in an eternal way. And the Ramban says it could be, which in a similar distinction between Tzimtzum Kipshute and Tzimtzum not Kipshute. One final word, there's a follow-up letter that the Rebbe wrote to Rabbi Binyamin, a few years later, dated Hey Sivan Tov Shin Gimel, which would be 4 years later almost, more than 4 years, and he says to him, you probably remember the letter, this is in the same Igros Kodesh, volume 1, page 127. You probably remember my letter to you about Tzimtzum, and the Rebbe speaks a practical applied Chassidus here. And if a person contemplates that in this space and in this moment, he has with him the Alter Rebbe and the Baal Shem Tov and the Arizal and the Rashbi, Beis HaIdra, and Rabbi Akiva, when he spoke about the Ma'aseh Merkava and the Kohen Gadol, the ways in the Holy of Holies, till Moshe Rabbeinu, at the moment of Matan Torah, there would be no room for anything but that reality. And that's what Chassidus paskins. The Maskana, the Einat Tzimtzum Ele Be'er V'lei Chaz V'Sholom B'Moyer. And the Moyer is with us right here, like the Kodesh Kodashim, and like by Agamat and Teda and Elam Atzilus, Elam and stuff, all the way to Tzimtzum, before Tzimtzum Addition, when it's Mala Mokam Achol. You have to see this in the letter, how the Rebbe describes the implication, the application and implication of Tzimtzum Not Kipshute. Now, I just touched the surface of the subject. As I said, I will address it next. We'll think of it part 2 and elaborate some more on the other two opinions. How do they fit into the 4 opinions on Tzimtzum Kipshute and the other questions that were included in this question. And let's move over and conclude with the 3 essays, again, briefly because of time. So again, 3 excellent essays. And they could all be seen, just as questions can be posed at meaningfullife.com, our beautiful new site, where you can post meaningfullife.com/MyLife, and meaningfullife.com/MyLife/essays, or contest, either one, I believe. And you can find the essays there, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter, and you'll receive them in your inbox. So 3 essays. The first one is 3 Steps to Becoming Content by Yisrael Barber, age 26, Sydney, Australia. And that is 3 ways to become content. Let me put it in the right order here. Okay. He begins, Hollywood has made its bread and butter on happy endings because at the end of the day, all we really want is to be happy. And essentially he discusses the difference between happiness and contentment, using as well the concept of object relations theory, which was developed by Theodore Roszak and Mary Gomes and others. And basically talking about the short-term happiness of our material world versus what true happiness is, as Chassidus explains it. This essay explores the drivers of discontent, drawing upon theoretical assumptions put forward by the object relations theory, and turning to the concepts of honesty, humility, and taking stock of one's sensory inputs as presented in Chassidic literature. The essay then demonstrates how the teachings of Chassidus Chabad address the underlying cognitive, emotional, and behavioral contributions to discontentment and provides a meaningful intervention. He quotes from the Maimer of the Frierdiker Rebbe said by the Rebbe's wedding, Chol Banayich, as well as some other siches from Maimonim from the Rebbe Rashab, and comes away with a very, I would suggest, a very powerful description of what makes people discontent, which is really their self-consumption, their self-absorption, as opposed to focusing not on themselves, but focusing on the cause, which of course comes to bittul. But he comes away with three cognitive, emotional, and behavioral suggestions and exercises in this concept. And again, I suggest reading this essay online. The next essay, The Meaning of the Mundane by Yosef Bronstein, age 30, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Theological Seminary at YU, Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies in New York. Okay, this is essay, The Meaning of the Mundane. And he begins, the Odyssey years, millennial searchers, much has been written to describe an emerging generation of adults that choose commitments and permanence. And yet, despite people's worship of the temporal, there was one notable exception, their quest for meaning. So he discusses the context of the quest for deeper meaning in a world that has become so materialistic. Very good essay as well, and basically focuses on the Rebbe in Kuntis in Yono Shel Teres Chassidus, explaining how Chassidus redefines the whole concept of meaningful activity. Because, meaning is, of course, an interesting word, but what does it mean according to Chassidus? And talks about it in meaning, not just as meaning, but as bringing the divine into this world. And he brings many different sikhs about it, especially one about Melech Basada, using Melech Basada, which means bringing the divine into the mundane, which is the Sada, and applying that meaningfulness ultimately is about bringing the Elokus into existence. The young adults who are starved for meaning and purpose are engaged in a positive quest. We should all live lives that we consider purposeful and meaningful. However, with the Rebbe's teachings in mind, we should rethink the criteria through which we determine meaningfulness and see the significance of the seemingly small, mundane details of ordinary life. It's not only the volunteering in a third world country, it's if God's presence permeates all of the reality that He can be found everywhere and everything, that is ultimately the greatest antidote to tedious, dull, mundane activity, understanding that it's all part of one reality called God. And finally, the third essay, Gratitude Attitude by Sarah Raskin, age 23, teacher at Beis Rivka in Crown Heights. Talks about the luckiness of this generation, how today every man lives more opulently than any ancient king, for all the advancements. And yet, how did the world come to the point where fortunate people are no longer happy? With all these blessings, why are we not happy? And basically goes to a mimer from the Friedrich Rebbe in Tafshin Yud that describes, in a groundbreaking mimer as she puts it, dissects the core of discontentment. Some parallels to the first essay I reviewed. Essentially, the person that feels entitled is a miserable man. Quite citing the story of the Alter Rebbe, where someone gave a whole list of things that he wants and doesn't have. The Alter Rebbe said, okay, you're telling me everything that you need, but what do you need it for? The idea of turning around the attitude, not just being a selfless person, but understanding that we have to have a different mindset and have a mindset of gratitude instead of one that we are entitled. Gratitude versus entitlement. Very well written. All of them actually are very well written and strongly recommended. So that's the third essay. And this has been MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 93. Freilich and Hanukkah, may the light of Hanukkah illuminate and warm each of us, and especially in the darknesses of our lives, each in our own personal way. And we should be zeichet to have the Kol Gadol Yeshiva Heinu and the Shnas Hakhel, Er Gadol of rekindling the Meneda in the Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi, and with the Geula Hamitis V'Hashleim. So until next Sunday, this has been MyLife Chassidus Applied, episode 93. Every Sunday, next Sunday, 8 to 9 p.m. Afreilich and Chanukah.